chapter 17 and verse 18. May I invite the rest of you, our brothers who are joining us online, to read together with us 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 17 and 18, reading. I am glad of the coming of Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaicus, for that which was lacking on your part they have supplied. For they have refreshed my spirit and yours. There acknowledge ye them that are such. Tonight I titled our meditation, Refreshing One Another. Refreshing one another. Nini nga panahon nga ito ang atubang. At some point, many of us may have become tired and weary. Some even may have been drained and dried up. Not much in the body, but in the soul. Come to think of it, 4 months in lockdown. Gani, medyo magkaginhawa na siguro tagamay kay kaganihagi downgrade kita into GCQ. But just the same, 4 months in lockdown. And I believe each and every one of us have our own story to tell about our ordeals, our struggles, our burdens, and how, by the grace and mercies of God, we are able to endure. Or perhaps, how you have been refreshed by others. Ako nagtuo, nga bisan pa man sa taliwa, sa kalisod, sa sitwasyon nga itong giatubang, the Lord in His grace and mercy have ministered unto us. And one of the ways and means that the Lord ministered unto us is by using men and women, by using people to be a channel of His grace and His mercy unto us. In this portion of his letter to the Corinthians, the Apostle Paul was commending 3 individuals, namely Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus, to the church, and encouraged them to receive these 3 affectionately and to recognize them. We read very particularly in verse 18 of his instruction of how the church should acknowledge them that are such. And what is the reason behind? Verse 18 tells us, they have refreshed my spirit and yours. They have refreshed my spirit and yours. The Apostle Paul acknowledged and expressed his appreciation what these brethren has done. And what is it that they had done? They have refreshed my spirit. Now, interesting kayo siya, mga kigsunan, because the word here, refresh, has that idea of easing one's burden, or lightening up one's burden, giving one some easiness. Mingon ganin that easiness ka na bang murag ni gaan, o imong gipagaan, o imong gipasayon ang kahimtang sa usa ka tao. Now, in simple terms, they have brought comfort to Paul. That's the idea behind the word refresh. No? They may have lightened up the burden of Paul. They may have cheered up the Apostle Paul. They may have encouraged the Apostle Paul. Now, in the most simple terms, sure, they have comforted the Apostle Paul. That's the idea behind the word. In fact, as you can see, in verse 17, the Apostle Paul expressed his gladness of the coming of these three persons, Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus, and he did mention, for that which was lacking on your part, they have supplied. Though we are not told what was it that is lacking, but one thing is that these three persons mentioned is, and they were the ones who had supplied what the church has lacked. In other words, dako sila natabang. In other words, dako sila og na hatag na pagdasig, dili lang kang Apostle Paul, kung dili sa tibuok simbahan. As you can see in verse 18, they have refreshed my spirit and yours. Now, usa kabutan na ako ang manotice dinhi is how the Apostle Paul indeed admitted and acknowledged of being refreshed by others. Now, why do I say this? It is simply because it is a humbling act on the part of the Apostle Paul to acknowledge that he was encouraged by others. To acknowledge and to admit that he has been comforted by others. Nga naman, for oftentimes, we always have that kind of understanding that the Apostle Paul, being an apostle, he should be the one who does the encouraging. We always have that expectation that Paul, being the apostle, it should be his duty to encourage others, to refresh others, to comfort others. While it is true, that is why I'm bringing this to your attention, while it is true, that is primarily our expectation, but please understand that the Apostle Paul, even when he is an apostle, he still is human. Gani, as I have said, it's a humbling act on his part to acknowledge that he has been refreshed by other people. Now, while we often hear it said, it is better to give than to receive. In this case, it is humbling to receive than to give. What I mean by humbling to receive is, it is humbling to acknowledge, especially in the part of the Apostle Paul, that he is being encouraged and comforted by others. Kani ako po ning ipaabot diha kaninyo mga kaigsunan nga being your pastor, I also am thankful to the Lord for oftentimes I have been refreshed by you. In other words, we are in this together. No? The idea here is mutual edification, mutual encouragement, mutual comforting. Na kung imong malantawan diha, the Apostle Paul never portrayed himself as superhuman. Nga, bisan tuod og deep inside, he realized that he has been comforted and encouraged by others, that he would keep it to himself because I'm an apostle. I should not be acknowledging this. It would undermine my being an apostle. No. That is why ako niya gipaabot diha kaninyo that Paul, being an apostle, acknowledged and admitted to have been refreshed by others. And this should also bring to mind the reality that pastors, preachers, missionaries also need to be refreshed. Na samtang mag-expect ang simbahan na katungdanan sa pastor, sa misyonero, o sa mga preachers ang pagdasig kanila, katungdanan usab sa mga kasimbahanan ang pagdasig sa ilahang mga pastor. ang pag-comfort o pag-encourage sa ilahang missionero o sa ilahang mga preacher. The idea here, again, as I say, mutual edification. This time, as you can see, the Apostle Paul is indeed sincere in telling the church, they have refreshed my spirit and yours. Nga naman, think about it. If a few people are able to encourage the Apostle Paul, then the Apostle Paul would also be encouraged to carry on with his labor. And if the Apostle Paul is encouraged and comforted and strengthened that he is able to carry on with the work, the rest in the church would also be encouraged. Diyan nato makita, mga kaigsunan, that after all, we are members of one body and that we need one another. But then again, I just would like to bring to your attention this reality here, humbling as it may be, but yes, the Apostle Paul himself admitted having been refreshed by others. You know, mga kaigsunan, in this time and season, ako nagtuo that the Lord has used people to refresh us. Perhaps you may have particular names and names of people whom the Lord may have used to refresh you, to have encouraged you, to have comforted you in these most trying times. Gani, niyadtong miaging Domingo during our youth fellowship, one of our young people was sharing his testimony nga taon-taon na yung ko nga trabaho, work at home, pastor, o niya, murag, wak na mo kakita og tao. Kanus ako manhin mong struggle good na to ang di kakita tao. But then again, for a long period of time, nga nakakarating, yes. And as I look at it, nga diin for the first time nga nagkatigong ang young people through Zoom online fellowship, it is such a joy to see them seeing and hearing one another after 4 months of lockdown. So it was a what? A time of refreshing. A time of refreshing. Yes, that is a reality. Nga diin atong makita that the Lord have been using people to refresh us. In fact, as we reflect upon this situation that we are having, even at this time, we can think of people whom the Lord used to refresh us. We may have been refreshed by their lives. We may have been refreshed by their labors. Or we may have been refreshed by their love and care. Okay? Their life, their labor, and their love. And in such a manner nga ilaha kining gipabot nganhi kanato. These people are what we call vessels of God's grace, who the Lord has used to refresh our tired and weary souls. They may have been an encouragement to us. They may have been a comfort unto us. They may have cheered us up, either by their greetings, by their short messaging, by their gestures, by their thoughtfulness. Now, that's the most that we can have at this time. God are the days that we can have a comforting hug or embrace, or a comforting shaking of hands. But just the same, their thoughts, their gestures, Perhaps their short messages, even their prayers, may have been a good source of our being refreshed. Not much in the body, but as I have said, in the soul, in our inner man. True. These are God's channels and vessels of God's grace, whom the Lord has sent and used to refresh our tired and weary souls. They may have strengthened us. They may have supplied not much of material or monetary supply, but they may have supplied us, giving us the boost that we need to carry on with life, to carry on with our labors in the ministry, to carry on with our service in the ministry. Now, having mentioned about these people, may we be encouraged like the Apostle Paul to thank God for them. In fact, Paul in verse 18 said, "They have refreshed my spirit and yours." And so what? Ingon niya, "Therefore, acknowledge ye them that are such." Acknowledge ye them that are such. In other words, we need to recognize them. Now, of course, lest it would somehow cause some misimpression or misinterpretation. To acknowledge them is to remember them in the Lord. Thank God for them. Kaya kung nagtuo, niining atuwa nga giatubang karon nga krisis, daghan kita og mahinumduman nga mga ngalan o mga dagway sa mga tao whom the Lord has used as His vessel and channel of His grace. That like the Apostle Paul, they have refreshed your spirit and my spirit and our spirit. And thus, we ought to acknowledge them that are such. Even among us, diha sa atoang group messaging, yes, we have been refreshing one another. Although we are mindful, we are careful that we always would bring glory and honor unto the Lord. But if there is indeed that sincere acknowledging and recognizing of a brother or a sister, and of how that brother or a sister has encouraged us and has comforted us, praise God. It is our way of encouraging one another. Now, as I have been saying, this is indeed a very humbling experience. Now think about it this way. To allow others to refresh and to acknowledge that we have been refreshed by others oftentimes is considered as a weakness by many. No. Don't be deceived. To allow others to refresh and to acknowledge that we have been refreshed by others is not weakness, but rather it is a sign of authenticity, that genuineness, to acknowledge that after all, we are human. Nga nanginhanglan butag mga pagdasig o pag-comfort gikan sa uban. It is but a testimony that God's grace is so much at work among the body of believers. When there is that mutual comforting and mutual encouraging, it is a testimony of God's grace working in each and every heart. And it is but not just a testimony, but even a powerful witness for people outside the community and body of believers to see. Di ba nindot kailan taon? Nga diin kita within the body of believers are engaged in mutual edification, mutual encouragement, mutual comforting, and people from outside the community are watching and seeing what we have been doing all this while. I'm sure they are also being encouraged and being blessed. Nga madasig sa sila, nga makakita sila sa the essence of Christian brotherhood, the essence of being a member of household of faith, that there is indeed mutual love, there is indeed a care for one another. And that is what we can see in here from the Apostle Paul. Yes, he allowed himself to be refreshed by others. He even acknowledged himself that he has been refreshed by others. And to think that the Apostle Paul is an apostle indeed, and he acknowledged it, may we also be encouraged. Ato apod na dawaton o ato apong i-recognize. And indeed, be quick to praise God and thank God for people whom He used to minister to us, to encourage us, and to comfort us. Gani, in the case of the Apostle Paul, it is one thing that we can learn of him. Because in all his time, in his labor in the work of the gospel, he has always been mindful to acknowledge and to recognize how other people have refreshed him. It's not just in his letter to the Corinthians that we will find it. If you have your Bibles, you turn to 2 Timothy chapter 1. 2 Timothy Sorry. Wait, huh? I got it wrong. I'm trying to find that verse about Onesiphorus. Okay. 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 16. 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 16. Tanaw na po diha. How Timothy, or rather how the Apostle Paul acknowledged to Timothy that he has been refreshed by this one man named Onesiphorus. Look at verse 16. The Lord give mercy unto the house of Onesiphorus, for he oft refreshed me, and was not ashamed of my chain. Now, as you know, this second letter of Paul to Timothy was written while he was in prison. And in here, he was narrating to Timothy about Onesiphorus. And what is it about Onesiphorus? He mentioned here, he oft. Now, oft is the short form for often. He oft what? Refreshed me. And how is it that he was refreshed and was not ashamed of my chain? I am convinced that this Onesiphorus, having learned that the Apostle Paul was in prison, this man named Onesiphorus would oftentimes go and visit the Apostle Paul in jail. And for that reason, Paul here acknowledged to Timothy that he oft refreshed me, and he was not ashamed of my chain. In other words, that he often would go and visit Paul in jail while he was in prison. And the Apostle Paul would take it to mean that Onesiphorus is never ashamed to be identified with the Apostle Paul, who at this time has been an enemy of the state. Makita nato diha that the Apostle Paul indeed is mindful to acknowledge, even to recognize how he has been ministered unto and how he has been refreshed by others. And in this case, there is a mention of Onesiphorus, which according to him oft refreshed him. Now, in his letter to Philemon, we also have read of this. Turn to Philemon for a while. In Philemon, of course, there's only one chapter. Philemon and verse 7. Philemon verse 7. Look at what Paul here said. For we have great joy and consolation in thy love, because the bowels of the saints are refreshed by thee, brother. So, makita nato diha how the Apostle Paul recognized Philemon in his refreshing of the bowels of the brethren. In other words, it will give us that understanding that Philemon have been a great encouragement to the brethren. How? We have great joy and consolation in thy love, because the bowels of the saints are refreshed by thee, brother. So the Apostle Paul there recognized how this Philemon indeed has refreshed the bowels of the saints. Coming down to verse 20, you would find there that the Apostle Paul not only expressed his recognition of how Philemon refreshed the bowels of the saints. In verse 20, you will find the Apostle Paul requesting that Philemon would refresh him. Look at verse 20. Yea, brother, let me have joy of thee in the Lord. Refresh my bowels also. Now, isn't it of great comfort? Seeing from the Apostle Paul, while it is such an humbling act on the part of Paul to acknowledge that he has been refreshed by others, now he is even asking others to refresh him. Now think for a moment. It is like the Apostle Paul requesting, if not pleading, for Philemon to what? Refresh him, to encourage him, to comfort him, to relieve him of his burden, or to ease his burden, or to free him from sorrow and care. Talagsaon ni siya nga hiyas, mga kaigsunan. Because we seldom hear of people making such requests to another. But you know what? This is the kind of spirit that we must have. That humble spirit in us. Sa mga panahon nga murag lisod, be humble to recognize, be humble to acknowledge that you need to be encouraged. Unya kita usahay manggod. Dali ra pud kay ta nga mo lukso into conclusion. Sa ato ang mga pinulangan ng ganita nga naglanay ra na, nagmanya ra na may we be sensitive to one another's burden. That even when there may be times that you may think otherwise, I'd rather that we would err in doing what is the right thing to do, rather than err in failing to do that which is right. Kay di man nato malikayan usahay, especially in a community and a body of believers, and through the years we may have known each other, our sensitivity and our kanang mga weaknesses. Mao gid na siya, inanadar na siya, sensitibo na siya. Mura bang ato adayon nga i-undermine rather than take it as it is and do what is supposed to be the right thing that we should do. Now, I may not be able to address all the burdens and cares of every one of you, but as much as possible, I would take it seriously and earnestly. Nga gani, dahil mga panahon na ato ang gibuhat, and then we realize na yes, bisan sa gamay na ito nga nahimo, and then the brother or the sister have appreciated it that much, na ikaw na lang yung magayon, Lord, salamat kay imo, you know, kay bisan pa man tuod sa ato ang bahin is but a little act or a little gesture that we may have done, yet the person on the receiving end greatly appreciated it. Mo kana nga we'd rather err in doing that which is right rather than ato addiction i-dismiss ba nga. Mauligi na, kanang usual na ito nga mga termino o mga expression ba. Naglanay na, nagmanya na, nagpapansin. No. Let's be sensitive. Because after all, we have this duty to one another. To what? To refresh one another. Learn from Paul. He's never ashamed to acknowledge having been refreshed by others. He is always open to be refreshed by others. In fact, he is open to request from others to refresh him. Now, having said, it must come to us as well that if the Apostle Paul is willing to be refreshed by others, may we also be encouraged that we also be willing to refresh others. After all, it's supposed to be mutual. We are to do it to one another. And we do it to one another not as a form of payback. Nga ato ala kong pilion ang ato ang i-refresh. Katurok mo naka-refresh nato. Now, that defeats the very purpose of mutual edification. Remember, we are many members of one body. And we are, whether we like it or not, we are members of one another. And one of our duty to one another is to what? Refresh one another. And we do it with that attitude of sincerity and with thanksgiving to the Lord for how we have also been refreshed by others in many occasions. Again, to emphasize that we do it to one another not as a form of payback, but out of that gratitude in our heart, knowing of the many occasions that we also have been refreshed by others. Ganit, these are the things na angay na ito nga i-cultivate sa tuang panahon karon. Just when you think that it's over, kaya na-GCQ ba ta? Na-GCQ na ta? No. Layo pa kayo tas tinuod mga kaigsunan. Yes. Till time nga diin ato nga ma-apply kini nga patulunan nga atong gitun-an karong kagabhion. In fact, in these difficult times, the more that we should go out of our way to refresh one another. And how are we to do it? We must be sensitive to the burdens and cares of others. Now, not as busybodies, but being sincere. Keeping in touch with one another. Perhaps, yes, we are in our group messaging. Once in a while, we hear from one another. But I am sure nga, na yung mga uban na ito nga mga kaubanan nga, they may be bearing with some burdens and cares na wala nila nga i-share diha. Now, let us learn from the Apostle Paul. He allowed, he acknowledged others who refresh him. He also admit, requesting to be refreshed. Now, what I'm trying to say is, yes, if you happen to have that burden and care, ayaw kong kauaw sa pag-share niya na. Like what we have learned from Paul, that he even not only admitted and to have acknowledged to have been being refreshed, he even asked that he be refreshed. Kay usahay, naamon tayo iba, kanay pag-itawag ba nato kauaw? Ayaw! How would the rest know? Unya, huwag na apoy mo share. Be very sensitive of what is being shared. Pray about it. As I have said a while ago, we may have some kanang preconceived ideas or impression about the brother or the sister. Ayaw. Take it as it is. Be objective. O kung sige siya, pray about it. And you may be kanang iyo pa na to surprised that even in these small gestures that you may do, they surely will appreciate it. Yes. Mas gikinahanglan nato ni sa ato ang panahon karon. Especially so. Now, sa una we can go for what? Atong bisitahan ang atong igsuon dito kay medyo naluya man. Karon murag di man yun appropriate ang pagbisita. So, what to do? Communicate. Use the ways and means that the Lord has opened up for us. If you want to be refreshed, open up. And if you want to refresh, pray in your heart. Be ready to refresh. Nga naman, walay lain nga makahimo niini kanato kung dili kita ra usag-usag within the body of believers. That there has to be that openness. And then of course, we must be mindful of that sincerity also on our part. Whether you are on the receiving end of the equation or you are on the giving end of the equation, regardless, we just have to be very sincere with our motives. Motives in what? Motives in pouring and sharing your burden, and also motive in giving and extending encouragement and comfort. Either way, nga naman, gikinahanglan nato na meaning one another, especially in these most trying times. Now, more often than not, makasugat kita o mga hindrances, obstructions, even mismo sa ato mga kasing-kasing. May I encourage you mga kaibigan to refresh one another. Need not be that you shell out money or you shell out or pour out some resources. You know, there are times that all they need to have is a listening ear. All they need to have is somebody who is willing to listen, comfort, and even to pray for them. May we be the one that is able to refresh them. Nga naman, for the Lord also have used and will use people to refresh us. And as we have been trying to emphasize, this is our duty to one another. It is our practical duty to refresh one another. It is mutual, and that we need to cultivate this atmosphere. We need to cultivate this attitude among us. As I have said, because no other people can and will do this to us. Kita o kita makahimo nini alang sa usag-usag kanato. And so, whether you be the one who do the refreshing or you are the one being refreshed, either way, mga kaibigan, it is a blessing. If you happen to be on the giving end, the one who do the refreshing, or you happen to be on the receiving end, the one who needs to be refreshed, it's a blessing. Either way, we just have to do one after another. Kaya nga naman, not at all times that we are on the doing end. For there are just times that we find ourselves on the receiving end. So, refresh or be refreshed. Either way, it's a blessing. And if we do it with all sincerity, surely the Lord is pleased. And as the Lord is pleased, surely the body of believer is blessed. May we be encouraged to carry on with this practical duty and responsibility towards one another.